Welcome, Brandon, once again to BeyondPhrenology.
Great to be here.
So, Brandon, we had some really interesting discussions in the last episode, uh, and you touched upon a little bit about memory. But as much as I read, I think memory is one of your core expertise, and a lot of your recent ideas have been uh, thinking about memory, or what I can call rethinking about memory. So, why don't you introduce us to some of the core issues in memory research? Like what is the state of the art, and what are the some of the unfounded assumptions on which a lot of what we know is based on?
Yeah, so memory has been a topic that I've been interested in since I was in probably high school. And I've always found the idea of mental time travel to be really interesting and appealing. And it's always been an experience that I've been really curious about. And I originally was trained as a traditional memory researcher. So my thesis was on perspective memory, which is memory for things in the future, like remembering an appointment or remembering to give a note to a friend, something along those lines. And I met what has become, a really important mentor in my life, which is Jeff Wagman, while I was doing memory research. And that sort of springboarded my career in ecological psychology. And the question that I've been wrestling with for pretty much my whole career is how can we explain memory from an ecological perspective? And one of the things that is a huge barrier for that is the assumption that the things that we're in contact with, the experiences that we have, are copies of the environment. So they're not actually the environment itself. Like the assumption for most of the time that psychology has existed is that we're in touch with a representation of reality, or some sort of copy of it that's separate and private, something that we experience that's different in important ways from the actual physics of the environment. So the assumption for traditional memory research has always been that in order to be in contact with the past, we have to carry around a copy of it with us. So perception in and of itself is thought of as making copies of the environments which we're in contact with, and then memory is storing those copies that we've created during perception, and then retrieving it from our memory system, which is something that is usually localized in the nervous system in the way that traditional researchers have talked about it. And so one of the things that I've realized throughout the time that I've been attempting to do ecological memory research, which has a very different assumption, of course, about what it is to be aware of the environment instead of making copies. The idea is that we're directly perceiving the environment by detecting energy arrays that are specific to things in the environment. We can actually be in touch with the actual environment, and we ourselves are a part of that environment that we're in touch with, of course, as well. So the idea that we're in touch with something that's in the past that isn't currently happening is something that can be a little bit awkward to explain given that starting point. But one of the things that I realized is that the biggest problem with both approaches to understanding memory is some confusions about what time actually is. So there's a really common sense assumption about time that's inherent in the way that we usually talk about memory, which is that things that happen in the present are here and then they're gone. So in order to be in touch with something in the past, we have to have the ability to kind of store it and take it with us through time, which is something that I realized isn't necessary if we rethink what time actually is. And that's something that I've been doing for the past several years. And I realized that we can completely dispense with representations and their usefulness in describing memory if we think about time in the same way that we think about space. So just because we can't look around like we can in the space that we're currently in, doesn't mean that we're not continuously existing in time, and time isn't expanding. It seems that the biggest difference between the present and the past isn't that we've necessarily left it behind per se. I think we continue to be aware of things that have happened throughout the time that we're conscious as living things. It's just that we can no longer interact with them. We can no longer affect change in things that have happened in the past, and that's the starting point that I have for rethinking the way that we think about memory as an awareness of something that has happened in a time that we can no longer affect. So it's a fixed event that we're experiencing as opposed to perception, which is a more fluid event that we can actually, as living things, interact with.
Right. On that note, just a distraction. I saw your iWatch, and I always had this idea: why do we have these days and hours and seconds and cyclical patterns in our watches? Why can't we have watches which start ticking when we are born, and it tells you your age? Because in fact that matters. But when I was thinking about this, I wasn't aware much that time is more for coordination. These watches than actually knowing where we exist, in time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, it does. You think about a watch as something that allows you to keep track of time when really its functional purpose seems to be more so to allow you to coordinate with your actions in a time expanding.
Exactly, and with the action of others, in a very embedded cultural sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So, Brandon, a lot of to unpack in what you said. Uh, let's assume that we do not have a value statement to begin with, and we don't know whether memory is based on some kind of copying of the environment or creating representations, in your central nervous system, or not creating representations. And let's be open to both possibilities. We have the copies, and we do not have the copies. So when we have the copies, how would retrieval look like? And if we do not have the copies and we have some other way of having memories, what will the retrieval process looks like?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So, assuming that there are copies, so taking a traditional approach to describing memory, the way that I describe it in my classes is sort of like a storage system. You have a really large storage system, and every experience that you have, you file away in that storage system, at least just keeping this specific to episodic memory. There are of course other memory systems as well that matter, but I'll just keep it to the memory of our events that have taken place in our life. And the idea is that when we encounter something that is similar enough to that event, it cues something in that storage location that we can then pull out and bring into our consciousness. So the idea is that forgetting may be understood as you losing some of those things that you file in your memory system, or something else covering it up and you not being able to find it anymore. That's the interference theory of forgetting. And the idea also could be that some of those things that are in your storage system just decay away, like things tend to do over time. So those are two different ways of explaining the dynamics of that storage system that we have. And that's also considered long-term memory. Assuming that we don't make copies of things, that we exist in time and time is asymmetrical, such that events that have happened before the current moment are things that we can no longer affect, but there's still things that we continue to be aware of, then memory becomes really no different than perceiving any sort of pattern that exists, any sort of spatial temporal pattern. So the idea would be that rather than retrieving a memory, you might notice some sort of pattern that exists in your experience from the fixed things that have happened in your past that apply to the current things that you're doing right now. And that pattern pattern would be considered from a traditional standpoint to be the equivalent of you viewing and retrieving a memory from that storage system.
Okay. So coming back to the former case, in which there are copies of events, episodic events, which you retrieve, just like very much like a file and drawer system. Uh, I guess the philosopher, which I think closest to who would have commented the way I will draw an analogy about it would be Dan Dennett. So it would be like you have these copies, and then you'll pull those copies, and with some kind of projector inside your brain, you will project that copy of memory on your consciousness or on your current awareness, right? And the one which decay is kind of that you have an old CD drive and it just doesn't work because of scratches or because of some kind of degradation on that material substance, which drives that that memory. You cannot project that onto your the so-called projection screen inside your head.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, but that comes with a lot of baggage. So it implies that once you store memories, you're done with it, in the sense that you're not in touch with them, so the file is in the drawer. It also implies that you need to have an index, because how else, if it is spatially somewhere, how else would you go to retrieve it, right? How would you navigate whatever landscape the memory is embedded in, and then how would you connect those memories together, because it implies some kind of a linear arrangement of episodic memories inside the brain, right? And then you would need these nested structures or nested indexing to relate them to each other. So for instance, let's if somebody asks me, how many watches I had in the past, right? I can instantly track, almost like pretty accurately how many watches I had since my childhood, and even which brands. So, but when those memories were forming, I was not aware of this question that it would ever arise. And somehow all those events of me having a new watch have been related in time. And I have that sudden access to all of that, all of those events. Is it possible without having any kind of index, or without having any kind of, a connection between those? And likewise, so for example, one of my uncles gave me one of my first watches, and somebody asked me, what all gifts has an uncle given me throughout my life? I can instantly, recall about all those gifts. So then there can be an infinite number of such questions relating infinite number of such things, and then you go into this problem of connecting. And if that connection still happens, let's say that kind of nesting happens, then the question is that whenever something new happens, do we go back and we try to make all the possible connections to all the previously formed memories? Right?
Yeah, it's yeah, I agree that there are a lot of philosophical quagmires with this approach, and you've described one really well, which is the basic problem of how is it that we're able to relate current experiences to past memories that we have. How is, as you said, how is it that we're able to index that storage system so that it makes sense at all to us, and we have the ability to actually retrieve memories. And I think that most memory researchers would answer that question by using the concept of spreading activation. So the idea would be that you're always using your past experiences to interpret your world around you. So the idea is that when you activate that thing that's close enough, whether it be because of some sort of similarity of the features of the events that you're experiencing. In the case of your watch, it would be an object, obviously, that we consider in the category of a watch that would spread through the activation of all of those past watches that you had, as a way of being able to understand or perceive, this watch, for instance. And the idea is that whether it's indexing through that similarity or indexing through contingency or frequency of experiences are other indexing hypotheses that scientists have had about how we're able to remember things. I think that would be the sort of most popular response to that question, I think, from that approach.
Yeah, but then I can always ask, okay, if it's about the activation or the level of activations, right? And given that the large variety of memories we can have, a large variety of kinds of events or details of those events, what exactly is that activation? And let's say if we can measure that activation in certain ways, does it have all the resolution we need for the activation to have some kind of correspondence with all that in almost infinite number of events?
Yeah, it's hard to say that could be the case. And the other issue is where does the indexing come from to begin with? So how is it that we're able to even create a concept of something like a
Yeah,
watch when watches themselves can vary in color, in shape, in whether or not you wear it or whether you have a pocket watch, but we consider those things all the same. So there's sort of like intelligence that's imbued in the system that doesn't exist in any reasonable philosophical way. So this becomes a really intractable problem. It's what ecological philosophers and scientists have described as a loan of intelligence, or loan on intelligence, which is the idea that you keep pushing intelligence back developmentally until you don't have to really worry about it anymore, but the origin of that intelligence is never really actually identified. And I think that the issue of how you're able to actually create these inherent categories inside of this mental storage system, originates to begin with, is something that is a pretty difficult problem to solve, I think.
right. Exactly. I mean, at some point, it boils down to that we are born with these innate intelligence, and then the question is that I'm probably I don't think there's a recourse to that, right? Let's say if I say that we are born with this intelligence, and it's just in our genetic blueprint, assuming that there's a blueprint, that we have this kind of constrained structure which allows us to, what's wrong with that argument, to have these genetically acquired structures?
Yeah, the
Why is it that why is that not a possibility?
It is definitely a possibility, and it is something that people have argued before in the past. It's kind of goes back, as far as I can tell, without looking into it right now, to Kant's ideas of the inherent categories of minds that exist, which he suggested explicitly was something that was inherent, something that we're born with. And then
Yeah,
from an evolutionary perspective, that poses an entire host of new problems. So how is it that these categories emerged phylogenetically? When did they evolve? Are they something that other organisms in our tree of life also experience or have? What's different about
right,
these categories? And these can be really thorny issues, which can really really continue to pose bigger and bigger problems, especially because it's a lot more difficult to sort of trace back the cognitive evolution of species, at least in the way that we think about cognition,
yeah,
because there's no fossils of cognition per se. All we really have is the some of the ecological behaviors of organisms that we can look back at. So it becomes a very difficult problem, just in the sense of trying to trace back the evolutionary history of thought, in general, I think.
right. Yeah, exactly. Like when did our ancestral in the evolution of the human species did we start having categories for watches, given
Right.
our
So
ancestors never used to wear watches, right? It's a very recent invention.
yeah, and the idea that we classify any objects at all into categories is something that can be a little bit difficult to explain the origin of, and it's very difficult to trace that back. Not that psychologists haven't done it. There's a lot of research in evolutionary psychology that does attempt to explore how some of these categories of thoughts emerge, but it's a difficult thing to do, and there are inherent issues with it because we can't actually directly measure any of those things currently, unless you look at species that are in the same genus or family as us, and then we can sometimes use that as a way of sort of rolling back the evolutionary clock, but it still is a little bit of a difficult thing to try to do. I think not that it's
Right.
I don't think scientific theories are inherently wrong or right. So, like, I think that they're useful, and there definitely has been a lot of really productive research in evolutionary psychology that does assume that those categories of thoughts or some of the things that you would traditionally think of as knowledge or memory in studying how some of those things have emerged throughout our evolutionary history.
Right. 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 So, I mean that's the former case where assuming the copies of memory exist, and when you do not have the copies of memory, then you said that we are recreating those memories, if I'm correct, right?
Um,
Or we are living in this time space more continuously in a in a discrete fashion implied by storage.
yeah. So, in the description of memory that doesn't assume that we are storing copies of the environment in order to be in touch with our past, but instead we just continue to exist in time, and we continue to be aware of everything that has happened in a sense throughout the time that we've existed. Instead of having to posit storage systems or anything like that. Instead, you just have to realize that our ability to be in touch with our past is more about pattern recognition, in the same way that you're able to identify that something that you're looking at in front of you, like maybe a puzzle or something like that, has a pattern to it that exists spatially. I think that we're able to do that temporally as well. So when we're retrieving a memory, to use the parlance of a representational approach, instead what we're doing is recognizing a pattern that exists through space and time that we are aware of, because we are always aware of the things that are happening to us as long as we're conscious beings.
But again, the question is that how do we recognize that particular pattern? Like what exactly it is that kind of zooms in, or I don't know what appropriate words to use, but bring those particular events to our attention in that continuous field of time.
Yeah, so the example that I like to use to demonstrate the power of this type of time-based pattern recognition is if you revisit a place that you haven't been to in a really long time. So if you go back to your hometown, or you go back to your college town, or some other place that you have a lot of experiences at, but you have been removed from a long time from, so those experiences haven't been relevant for a really long time. Usually when you go back to that place, you're sort of flooded with all sorts of memories that you
Yeah.
haven't thought in forever, since you've been back at that place. And throughout the time that you were forming all of those memories, the ability to recognize all of the patterns that exist in your hometown, for instance, is something that was a little bit more spatially. Everything happens in time.
Yeah.
So it's not the case that anything's purely spatial. Everything is spatial temporal in that way. But you're able to recognize things like roads that allow you to get to work or to get to school. The ability to recognize that there's a certain place that you keep things that is stable over time. These are all patterns that emerge in our everyday experiences. And when you've been removed from those experiences, you no longer think about them because they're not a pattern that really matters. But then once you return back to that place, all those memories come back because all those patterns become relevant to you again. So rather than retrieving those past experiences, the idea is that you continue to really be aware of them. They're just a part of your experience that you haven't needed to recognize as a way to get around in the world. So suddenly all of those things that you had forgotten, they come back to you in that way. And it's
Right.
really just you recognizing the spatial temporal pattern the same way that you would
Right.
if you were still there.
So let's say that this description of memory is more tenable. Now, moving forward, we have a lot of neurophysiological findings. For example, different parts of the brain, which when you knock down and have some kind of degeneration, you start losing memory. So you can completely lose your memory. So how do we explain these changes in localized structures to this kind of formulation of a continuous time field?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't have a great answer to it. I think in reconceptualizing the way that we think about memory, so that we're not thinking about the copies of our experiences that we are able to retrieve in our storage system. There's all sorts of assumptions that go along with that have caused researchers to do the type of research that they've done. So, neuroscientists, assuming that there are places that we store memories in the brain,
Yeah.
have conceptualized it this way. And so they've done their research in a way to try to localize those areas of the brain that are responsible for storing some of those memories, or taking a broader approach and looking for larger population coding of memories is another approach that neuroscientists have used. And I don't have a great way of necessarily understanding the role that the nervous system plays in that. One of the ways that I've conceptualized the nervous system's role in our experience of the world is sort of like a resonance device. In a sense, we're able to kind of broaden our awareness, and that's not even the right way to really say it, but we're sort of able to have these redundant processes that take place that contribute definitely to the way that we experience the environments. But I'm not sure exactly what the role is for memory or even perception for that matter.
Right. So playing devil's advocate here, let's say the role of the brain is creating some kind of resonance. Let's assume that. So I have a scene in front of me, some event happens, right? And my brain resonates with that environmental information in a certain way, right? And either I retrieve, or either I'm able to somehow, uh, I don't want to use the word save, but let's say keep that particular state in more continuity, okay, or nested within other states over time, or I'm able to revisit that state, okay, in the same state in which I was part of that environmental information. You can always reform uh, or refine your word or use of representation and say that those were the representations. So what you are describing is not that the brain is not representational, but you're describing more a different way in which those representations are formed. So these are resonance-based representations rather than representations in a more information theoretical perspective.
Yeah,
So
that's a really good point. It's true. It is very much in a way just another way of saying representation. So saying that the nervous system resonates to the environment is not very much different than saying that it's storing information. And I think that the term information is one that is really tricky in and of itself. So it is used very differently by different people. It can mean different things in different contexts, and I think that sometimes we can ascribe meaning to it that isn't necessarily meaningful.
right,
The idea that information is being stored because your nervous system produces a chain reaction once you perceive something or once you detect something with your senses can be thought of as information about that event because
yeah,
there is a systematic relationship between the activity that's happening in your nervous system and the environment. But I don't think that that necessarily means that the nervous system is a information storage, retrieval, and processing device in and of itself. The same way that there's structure in the entire universe that exists. And by understanding that structure, we can do things like know what happened in the past. So for instance, you can look at the structure of I was thinking about this earlier because I saw when I was driving here these tire tracks that were in the road. So it was really clear that somebody braked and they slid kind of off the road, and you can see exactly where their vehicle went by looking at those tire tracks and how they kind of veered off of the road. So that in and of itself is information about an event that took place, but you
yeah,
would never say that the tire tracks themselves are storing information.
yeah,
Like the,
or they're representing that event
right,
in that
exactly.
sense.
Yeah, it's you can, if you have the ability to do so, use the structure of the universe in order to represent in a way things that have happened in the past, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's representing something in the way that we think about the nervous system representing information.
Right, which is more like one-to-one mapping of this mostly spatial pattern and like a series of spatial pattern, exactly the same way the way we do with like a video camera.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And we and I don't want to mischaracterize theories of memory. So most another component of every memory theory that's is a contemporary one is the reconstructive nature of memory.
Yeah,
There is definitely the idea that we're not, just playing back a video of something that happened in the past, but we're sort of on the fly reconstructing an event based on a weak trace that we've stored and everything that's happening currently. That's one of the ways that you can understand how flawed our episodic memory is, which it is very much the case that we misremember things all the time. It's something that we're actually not particularly good at.
right.
Is able to remember events that have happened in our life. But I think that if you don't think of this as retrieving some copy of a memory that is really weak and kind of reconstructing what happened in the past, but if you think of it more as pattern recognition,
Yeah,
makes a lot more sense to suggest that it would be really flawed because it is the case that the way that we're using those patterns isn't for the purpose of trying to travel back in time necessarily,
yeah,
but so that we can understand what's happening now and coordinate our actions with the environment.
right. So I mean, do these frameworks come under the idea of falsifiability? Like, what exactly is it about the practice of science that you can frame uh, your ideas of memory one way or the other? Like, can we design falsifiable experiments which suggest one or the other, or it is open to interpretation and value statements and more subjective orientations of scientists, investigating these phenomena? Uh, or is there any objective method uh, to at least figure out that one is more tenable than the other, uh, based on all sorts of both experimental and analytical tools we have?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think one of the things that we would need in order to disentangle, for instance, an ecological approach to memory from a representational approach to memory, you would need some sort of critical experiments or series of experiments to do that. And I'm not sure that I have an answer to that. I do have an experiment that I'm in the process of designing that would do one of the things that you suggested, which is if it were to be the case that I found evidence for the prediction that I had, then it would be more consistent with an ecological approach than it would be a representational approach. But one of the things that I always try to keep in mind as a researcher is that we're all wrong. In 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, we'll all be wrong in the end, except there'll be a couple of things that we're right about, right? So, and then all the observations that we make as scientists are
Yeah,
something that every future scientist has to reckon with, of course. So I think that what ends up happening to theories is that they run out of their usefulness, or sometimes there are critical experiments that do rule out one or over the other. One of the things that I've recently thought about doing, the experiment that I've thought about doing or am going to do once I figure out the details of it, is what you would predict from a representational approach in terms of memory, episodic memory, that is that when you're remembering some sort of event, the amount of time that that event or the duration of that event should be constant over time. So if the idea is that we're retrieving a memory trace from our storage system,
yeah,
it would be sort of like watching an old movie of something. When you're watching a movie that was made in 1920, it feels like the same duration now as it did when the movie was filmed or when it was first released. There's no difference in that duration because you're carrying a representation of that event through
right,
time.
right,
You're taking it with you.
right.
But the ecological approach to memory, the idea that you continue to be aware of things in your past, as if your timeline is just expanding, but because time is irreversible, it's the case that you can't go back and interact with events that you've passed by on
Yeah,
your own trip through time. So in that case, it should actually be the case that your memory of a duration of event should get longer and longer as time elapses. This is what's called time dilation, and it actually happens pretty quickly. It's the case that even your speed influences the relativity of time for you.
yeah,
If you're moving faster, then a clock will actually slow down for you compared to someone who's moving slower. And this is what creates actually what's called the twin paradox, which is the idea that if you were to be on Earth and your twin were to travel at a really high speed to a distant place and return, that you'd be a lot older than the twin who went on the spaceship the spaceship trip. Excuse me.
right.
So that is the fact that time is relative, and the duration as you move into the future should actually slow down
Yeah,
more and more for an event. So it could very well be tested by
Yeah.
having people estimate a duration now, and then have them remember that duration and estimate it from memory. And it should be the case that when you estimate a remembered event, it should be slower than it was when you perceived it. So that's one thing that I'd like to do to test that theory, which would, in a lot of ways, make it difficult to account for it if we
Yeah.
are in fact carrying a copy through time with us
Right.
of events that have taken place.
No, there are real world kind of experiences which resonate with what you are saying here. So, for instance, when I'm going to somebody's new, somebody has a new home, and I'm going to that address for the first time. When I go there, it feels like a much longer route, or it takes a much longer time compared to when I'm returning. It's always the case, right?
Mm. Yeah,
So,
yeah. There's definitely some phenomenological experiences that seem consistent with it for sure.
right. No, that's a very clever experiment. I'm just thinking of what can be alternative explanations or representation based explanations of those which should be ruled out in any such experiment.
Well, one of the things that I'm afraid of is that there's time compression as well that might counteract time dilation. So, in perceptual research, we're really familiar with distance compression. If something is further away, then it appears more compressed, like it appears as if
Right.
it's like if you're looking at let's say a
Yeah.
pen that's directly in front of you, it's going to look longer than if it's like 20 feet away, and that distance compression effect might also happen temporally. So it could be the case that would counteract the time dilation effect if it exists. So
Right.
I'm going to have to be careful about that and make sure that I don't make the durations too long, or else they might become compressed the same way that distance compresses the experience of
Right.
event.
But at the same time, the fact that time might feel compressed the same way as space does also talks a little bit about, it also supports your point that both time and space might be represented in a very similar fashion.
Yeah, yeah, I think certainly that should be the case. I don't think that we've found any evidence to this point that space and time can be kind of disentangled from each other.
Yeah.
I would imagine that those effects would happen in both cases, and we have a tendency in psychology to separate space and time in a way that
Right.
is is pretty inconsistent with what we know about space and time.
Right.
You can't if you're going to throw a baseball to someone,
Yeah.
uh, if you're playing catch with someone, then you can't get the ball there any faster without increasing the speed, which
Yeah.
is spatial temporal property. There's no way around that, and there's really nothing in our everyday experience that suggests that we should have any separate experiences of space and time, but we sort of treat them as if they're different things still in our field.
Right. No, all this also makes me wonder how much of our concepts and formulations of these phenomenological experiences are shaped by our language, in the sense that there are certain words like representation, for instance. And if I ask you, what is the synonym of representation, people might come up with words like encoding, which is a little different, the way it is technically defined. But there are not many synonyms for it, right? But as soon as you talk about some other words, they might have a much larger repertoire of synonyms. And
Mhm.
just because not each word is exactly the same, they are synonym at certain level, but they also have other nuances attached to them, and they can be used explicitly in certain other ways. That very flexibility of using those words might allow you to think about those phenomenological experiences much differently compared to these words, which do not have synonyms.
Mhm. Yeah,
Right.
I completely agree, and yeah, we always need some sort of lens in the way that we describe the universe that we're in. We
Yeah,
always have to have some sort of way of communicating it. I mean, a scientific theory in and of itself is taking something that is what it is. It exists in reality, and building a bunch of terminology that describe
yeah,
it in a simpler way. So there's almost no way around of the language, like the language we use, not affecting the way that we conceptualize some of these things. And our language always really comes pretty clearly from just our experiences. So you look
yeah,
at the way that some of the early philosophers who discussed, the mind-body problem, for instance, thought about the way that the mind and body work, like they were borrowing a lot of their terminology and their concepts from mechanics, from
right.
the I think Descartes saw a statue that was moving that had water flowing through it, which caused the limbs of the statue to move.
Yeah,
And so that's kind of the analogy that he used in describing the way the body moves, so that
right.
the mind has some sort of fluid mechanism that causes the limbs to innervate in very much the same way that we invented the computer, and then we took all of the terminology from computer science and applied it directly to psychology, which is something that in a lot of ways is almost inevitable if you're going to try to describe, explain, and predict something.
Well, Descartes was not completely wrong. There are certain parts of the body which are still hydraulic. I don't want to name, right?
Yeah, it's true.
So, okay, coming back to space and time. I mean, if you think about space, how many synonyms for space do we have
It seems.
compared compared to time, which have synonyms like period, term, right? Extent. I think
Mhm.
extent can apply to space, right? And then the idea of present, past, present, and future, right? Very much applicable to time. But do we have a concept like that for space? To, like I exist in space right now in this particular point in space. Uh, do we do not have this kind of a linear dimension to space? Where I talk about, right, like this was somewhere else, right? There's no, I'm not aware of those words, or at least they're not part of our common parlance, right? And likewise, we can use adjective like short term memory, long term memory, or short periodic memory, or episodic memory, or instantaneous something. We do not have those kind of adjectives to use for space.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. I've never really thought about that, but you're right. There aren't is much of sort of there isn't as much of a critical examination of space in
Right.
I think our fields specifically. Not that there aren't people that study space perception, for instance. That's of course, an entire field in psychology, but usually it's just about explaining how we're able to create three-dimensional representations of.
Yes, it's less about the properties of the space itself as in terms of time here, right? And I'm wondering, like we have been given so much flexibility to play with time dimension of existence with all these adjectives and design experiments along these on all these adjectives, but with space we do not have much room for creativity.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And if you look at the way that most memory theories are built, there is a very layered description of time. So there's your conceptualization of the future, then there's the present, which is what you perceive, of course, and then there's the past, which is something that you have to be able to recall or retrieve from your memory system. But the way that we move through space isn't really addressed nearly as much. And it is something that kind of goes along with the theme in psychology, where we've been a lot more focused on things that are internal as opposed to things that are external, I think.
Right, right. Yeah, almost every aspect of psychology has been like that. Yeah.
And so the interesting thing about time too, which is something that I think we'll always do as scientists, even is just kind of not understanding where our own blind spots are. So one of the blind spots I think that exists in the way that we think about time in psychology is the fact that our descriptions of time are not particularly consistent with the physics of time. So we sort of think that there's all of these internal mechanisms that determine how we actually experience time instead of really examining the actual way the time works. So one of the assumptions that we have is that there is a past, present, and future. And I think that if you were to ask most people why they have that assumption, I don't think most people really think about the fact that it is an assumption. But if you were to ask people why they have that assumption, they'd probably tell you that it's because of the way that cognition works. Like that the past, present, and future is something that is almost in a hallucination, right? Especially if you're talking to somebody that subscribes to like a block theory of the universe, which is the idea that everything's already happened. You know, there is no past, present, and future, and our conscious experience of things moving forward is something that's determined psychologically. But it becomes very different if you think about time as operating the same way that it does in physics, that it's operating the same way in psychology as it does in physics, then it creates a sort of a different starting point. The idea that we have a past, present, and future actually makes a lot of sense from just a purely physical perspective. It is the case that time is always moving forward. This moment that's happening right now will become a fixed event in the past. But before that happens, it is the case that all sorts of different things could happen. Of course, we're constrained by space and time and our own action capabilities, but there are to use a term from quantum physics, there are a number of superposed events, which means events that are all kind of simultaneous, but and could happen, but only one will actually happen. And those superposed events are just barely in the future, of course. And the further we look into the future of some sort of organism that is making its way through
Yeah.
its ecological niche, the more superposed events that there are. So it is the case that if you look at it from a physical perspective rather than a psychological one, it might really account for our experience of time.
Yeah.
The best example that I like to give that demonstrates this is imagine walking down a path where there's a fork in the road and two possible ways that you could go. It's the case that walking down both of those paths are things that we're currently perceiving. They're things that are slightly into the future, but the structure of the light that's reflecting off of the pathways allow
Yeah.
us to be able to perceive that both of them are possible for us to do. But once we choose one of those paths and we go down one of them, then one of the events, the two superposed events collapse, and only one of them happens. And the event that was possible is something that we can still experience. We can remember that it was possible to go the other way, but we can no longer ever go that other way because that spatial temporal moment is past. The same way that the moment passed when I talked about the moment a second ago.
Right. 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 No, no, fascinating. It's like the issue of memory is mind-boggling. It seems so intractable. I mean, what goes on in this mushy, you know, brain. I it's just mind-boggling. When you take out the brain from the skull and just look at it, like it's kind of a loaf of cheese, and what all that cheese is capable of, and how the cheese functions. Uh, Sitting inside this cavity is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it really is. It's really it's really fascinating how organisms have emerged. I mean, essentially, what separates us from non-living things is the fact that we can actually, have an effect on our environments that we can control, and we can kind of live a little bit in the future. So we're sort of
Yeah.
able to, stay not physically ahead of our timeline, but we're able to be aware of things that could happen in the future, and we can coordinate our actions with our environments to produce changes that end up happening in the present. And it's pretty mind-boggling to think that in the time course, or the geological time course of species emerging, that we've developed such sophisticated means for being able to do that.
Right. And yeah, and it's the same dimensions along which we humans are so much ahead compared to several other animal species, almost all animal species. Right.
Yeah, really miraculously in a lot of ways. I mean, the thing that separates us from other organisms, like aside from standing upright, and being able to use tools the way that we can, is our enormous brains, right? So,
Yeah.
like, as a matter of fact, it's kind of miraculous that we were even able to avoid extinction, because childbirth is even so hard for our species because of how big our
Right.
brain. But it is really kind of interesting how that process plays out. It makes you wonder, in other ecological niches, like on other planets, for instance, how organisms might evolve, and how different species kind of emerge as the most sophisticated ones throughout those time periods as well.
Right. And also, the same things which we have, the same wonders which we have created, right? For example, childbirth, and raising infants, till their teenage, and even later adults in some cases, to make them able to survive in the world, right? Which none of the other species do. It also sometimes make it seem a little flimsy, in the sense that how vulnerable we become, given that we are chaperoned by so much of technological and social support. But then at the same time, if you think about it, just like water is for fish, fish cannot exist without water. It's the same way, like I think this technological and social chaperoning is for us. It's not as much separate as it seems sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. It is really it's really it's really pretty unbelievable to fathom that we've been able to evolve the way that we
Oh,
have as humans, and yes, even the way that we, as you said, care for our young is very different than other organisms, because it's actually the case that we give birth to really premature infants, like compared to other organisms. Usually, infants, or the young of those organisms are born pretty much ready to go in the world. But our infants, when they're born, really need a lot of help. Like, they need their caregiver to be around for quite a long time before they're able to kind of go out into the world on their own, which is another sort of fascinating thing that should make us less adaptive,
right,
and in a lot of ways it does, but it has not hindered our ability to be able to kind of hit the fast forward button. I think, in the sort of evolution of our own species.
right, right. So coming back to memory, Brandon, again, uh, I mean, somebody can, play devil's advocate with you and say, Brandon, you have these, really cool stuff you have to say about memory, but at the same time, this implies kind of a radical. I mean, you're just an angry teenage radical kid who thinks that he has figured out certain things, and the world is going to be changed. if we start doing this or that, somebody suddenly coming up with some kind of a perpetual motion machine. Okay. So what would be your argument to those that we already have spent billions and billions on understanding memory or in formulation of memory science as a field of psychology and neuroscience, and now you have these ideas which are a little counter to a lot of our formulations, right? So there's a lot of burden you're carrying with these arguments, right? So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I've definitely gotten a lot of that, and one of the criticisms of ecological psychology in general that I've always felt isn't particularly fair is the fact that we focus mostly on perception action, and the theory can't, because it hasn't to this point, that it cannot explain other phenomena in psychology. And that's always kind of bothered me because there's a limited number of people who consider themselves ecological psychologists. And a lot of times when it has been expanded to other things, it's been pretty successful. I think there's been a lot of really important work that's been done in social psychology from an ecological perspective, how we're able to coordinate actions with other people, for
Yeah.
instance. And that sort of expansion is something that hasn't happened in memory, not because we can't. We can't. It's just because nobody really has tried before. At least, certainly, there hasn't been very many people who've tried to address some of those issues. And I would respond and have responded to people who've made some of those arguments that we already have so much that we understand about memory. There are so many existing theories that are very powerful and predict a lot of the data sets that we collect. So why is it that we need to re-explain it? And the what I would say to that is that because we're scientists, because we should never be satisfied with the descriptions we have of things. So there's always a better description that exists, and I could be wrong about absolutely everything. I always tell my students that the thing that a lot of people don't understand about science is that it's the process of proving yourself wrong. So what you do is you have an idea and you say, can I break this? Can I find evidence that runs contrary to this idea? That's what the entire thing is about. You never really learn anything from being right about something. So my response would be, I'm going to try to use the ecological approach to explain as much of this phenomena as I can, and it will fall short at some point of being able to account for everything, because every scientific theory runs into those walls, into those boundaries. But hopefully, in the process of trying to come up with better and better explanations, we can learn more and more about the things that we're studying.
Right. No, that makes complete sense. I mean that's how science progresses, right? We almost all are aware of that, but we get tied to our theories so much over time, given the sociological constraints under we live as scientists.
Yeah, it's true, and people can get very dogmatic about their approaches. And while I consider myself an ecological psychologist, I don't think that it's going to end up being the end all be all theory of cognition or of perception action. I think it'll run its course and it'll have its usefulness. And in 1,000 years from now, hopefully they'll look back at it as something that mattered because it was right about some aspects, or it provided a framework for people to test something that contributed a lot to the current theory that exists, 1,000 years from now. The thing I'm worried about, though, is that 1,000 years from now, humans won't exist. So,
Oh, I personally am not worried about it. I mean, if he exists, it's fine. If not, it's fine.
yeah,
I
totally.
mean, a lot of our ancestors, almost all of us who existed, our ancestors were produced, right? Of course, like we never had like a grandfather or grandmother who never reproduced, right?
Yes, yeah. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And those who did not, for them, does it really matter whether we exist or not? If you think about from that perspective, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's not going to matter certainly to any of us.
Yeah, exactly. I
Uh,
mean, uh, so yeah, and yeah, no, it's. I mean, I sometimes, so when I talk to my parents who are in India, right, or like I do a WhatsApp call, and it just makes me wonder, like we are communicating at the speed of light, right?
mm,
So basically, at the coordination level, we have shrunken the time, uh, right? And it's so puzzling that how is that even possible,
yeah.
right? And that back and forth coordination happens, and when you look at the lag, in terms of predicting what my parents are supposed to say and what I will respond, that lag doesn't conform to a lot of our neuroscientific, kind of, the transmission delays which we get the values of those, from looking at just neural transmission and looking at, the time it takes to process things, right? It just doesn't add up.
Sure. Yeah, it is. I mean, even right now, we're communicating across a vast space,
Yeah,
basically
yeah.
simultaneously. So it is something that's become commonplace. That's really kind of inconceivable in a lot of ways.
Right,
But
and a lot of times our arguments, we are coordinating much faster than a neural impulse can actually travel from my leg to my from my foot to my brain, right? And that communication is happening of a much, uh, like it's a very simple circuit inside the brain, right? You have some reflex circuits through the spinal cord where you hit on your knee and you will have a certain jerk, right? That itself is much longer in certain cases than we are communicating with these complex concepts, right? And the amount of neural resources being utilized in that, it just seems improbable that that can happen in a very linear fashion within that small time. It has to be like those hallucinations happening, across all those, and they're just going on in different directions, and some of them they just end up matching at that moment. So there wasn't a lot of planning involved in that, but a lot of coordination which happened in real time.
yeah, that reminds me a lot of, believe it's could be wrong about this, but I believe it's Kelso's work on synergies. So the sort of compensatory, spontaneous ways that you'll keep yourself, kind of in line with whatever goal-directed behavior you're doing in a way that's quicker than you would predict the neural response would need to travel
Yes.
if it was coming from the central nervous system. So I think I believe what he did is he had people, or him and his colleagues had people speak, and then they disrupted their jaw, I think is what it was. And they spontaneously were able to make the adjustment so they were still able to say the word that they were trying to say in a time scale that was quicker than what you would expect if that language was being downloaded from your central nervous system. So there is a lot of issues with the idea that there's that type of processing that's happening in real time that is allowing us to do some of those spontaneous actions that allow us to compensate when something disrupts what the motor commands might be that we've sent out from our spinal cord or nervous system or central nervous system.
Right. And the contradiction lies at every level. So for instance, we often use the metaphor of brain being like this a very high end parallel processor, right? But we know from our experience with parallel computation that parallel computation doesn't increase the speed of computation as much as it allows you to compute a lot of different things at the same time, right? So those parallel networks are not sufficient enough to have this kind of fast processing. I mean, putting a lot of resources doesn't mean that it becomes faster in that sense.
Yes, that's true. And there's also, I believe, there's energy concerns as well, like
Yeah.
the type of processing that it would require to do that type of parallel processing requires more energy than our brain actually consumes. That's another problem for that.
Yeah, the energetic constraints on the brain. Yes,
Mhm.
right. And the funny thing is that energetic constraints are also determined by your lifespan, for instance, right? You need to be able to have that neural tissue for that lifespan. So the metabolism in the brain has to somehow match uh your genetic makeup in terms of the kind of oxidative stress you have here over the life, right?
Right,
It's kind of synchronized with it, the energy expenditure.
right, and
You cannot have a musculoskeletal decomposition so much faster than the brain, or brain decomposing so much faster than the muscles, because then it's kind of a mismatch in the investment from an evolutionary perspective.
yeah, you'd end up either as sort of just a like kind of shell of yourself with your brain still working, or you'd be kind of brainless with your body still working, right?
Right,
Uh,
right, right,
those things would really match with what actually happens in the evolution of our life.
right. And that makes me wonder, like, why don't we have evolved a strategy where we actually invest more in terms of in our brain tissue or central nervous system with age, given that we have weakening of the bones and weakening of musculature and weak coordination? Why don't we put up even more cognitive resources then to counter that?
Mhm. Right. So if it's deteriorating less than the body, then that would, be a possible solution
Yes,
to that for sure. But
right,
it is not what happens. It's true. Both your brain and body deteriorates seemingly at the same rate. It seems well, very much different for different people. But yeah,
right.
uh,
Which one would
the
you choose though for yourself?
what is that?
Which one would you choose for yourself?
Oh, I want my body to still work. Yeah.
Okay.
I wouldn't
That-
even then I wouldn't even be aware that I could just kind
right,
of be tooling around and not know that my brain is gone.
right. That's very true. So, Brenda, where do you think, where does it all kind of leads to in terms of memory? Yeah, we need to rethink certain concepts. We need to reformulate some of the experimental ways. But if I am an experimental neuroscientist and I want to have some kind of animal model system, let's say, right? Because a lot you cannot do on humans. Yeah, I really want to understand more physiology. And then these time dilation uh, experiments become a little difficult to perform for any species other than humans, where you cannot have subjective reporting, for example, right? So, where do we go with that research? Like, where's the room for that kind of research in the framework which you are proposing?
Well, I think that there's a really important role for it. So I know that the nervous system is very much involved with cognition. I think that that's indisputable, I'd say. But I don't think that it should be the focus of how we understand things like memory per se. But obviously, there are a lot of memory deficits that people have that involve their nervous system. So there has to be a role that your nervous system plays, and at the very least, your awareness of things. So being able to kind of rethink the way that we think about memory causes you to rethink the way that you think about the role of the nervous system. And it is something that very much could be an area of really important theoretical and empirical development is trying to understand what the role of the nervous system is, understanding that it isn't the case that you need a specific type of nervous system per se in order to remember things like we would oftentimes assume that it would. But it definitely plays a role in how we're able to both perceive and remember.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that what will happen if we rethink the way that we think about memory is it'll be sort of a different role that the nervous system plays in it, and it won't be a role that separates perception and memory, for instance, in the way that we normally separate it. If you ask a contemporary neuroscientist what the difference is between perception and memory, you probably get a lot of different explanations. Some of them on the side of everything being a memory phenomena, that you're engaging your nervous system in order to perceive at all times. And then you'd have some people who think that it is very much a discrete difference, that when you're perceiving the environment, you're using different parts of your nervous system than when you're remembering the environments. And if one of the implications of accepting that copies of the environment aren't stored in your nervous system, is that distinction would go away, right? So we no longer have to posit separate
Right.
systems
Right.
in the nervous system for perceiving and remembering. So you would kind of redefine the way that you look at the nervous system as something that is continuous in time, with the events as such that the present is something that's always moving forward, and perception action is the thing that allows us to be in the present, but that our experience of the past isn't necessarily a categorical distinction, other than the fact that those events become fixed and no longer able to be interacted with, but wouldn't necessarily require a different subsystem in order to explain the difference in how we perceive it or experience it, I think is a better term.
Right.
So in short, I don't know. In long, it is very much the case that there's a role for the nervous system. It would just be a different one than the one that we think about,
Yeah,
contemporarily.
and that's a challenge. Like, how do we formulate and how do we attribute those roles to the nervous system from the ecological and active standpoints?
Yeah, it very much changes the way that you start to look at nervous system activity and understand its role. And
Right, right. I mean, there has been a lot of talks related to the idea of ecological neuroscience lately, right? For example, Lewis is coming up with a book on that, and several other people are writing articles and books along those lines. But at the same time, it seems to be the holy grail is to not just reformulate a lot of neuroscientific research in the ecological framework, but also to figure out what's the role of the central nervous system is, and to be able to design falsifiable research uh, uh, to test ecological theories.
mhm. Yeah, and the book that you're editing, in looking at different analogies for the brain, I think that there's some really interesting approaches to that as well. I think about the paper on thinking about the nervous system as a control system, is one of the papers in that
Yeah,
volume. And that's a really interesting way to look at it, right? The idea that it allows you to control your behavior at several different spatial temporal scales. Like that approach to the nervous system is, I think, really consistent with a lot of neuroscience that exists, but it also it sort of allows you to ask different and new questions so that you can address empirically. And I think that's one of the most important things about a scientific theory, is being able to be productive in that sense, allow you to ask questions that are falsifiable, and learn things about the phenomena that you're studying.
right. We discussed this in much greater detail, from a philosophical standpoint with Tony Shimura in the last podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I caught I think the first half of that, and it's super interesting too. Yeah.
So that was wonderful, Brandon. We delved so much deep into memory today. a lot of shaping thoughts on that, and a lot more formulation to be required. There's an awesome book I read. It's called The Island of Knowledge. And the idea is that the more you know, so knowledge is like an island. Unlike like a mainland, knowledge is like an island, and the bigger the island of that knowledge is, the bigger the cost of a lack of knowledge becomes as well,
Yes, yeah,
right?
yes. The more,
The more
yeah,
you know, the more is the unknown, right?
yes, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
It's such a great point. Yeah, it's
yes, and ecological arguments are really good. It's like they instantly take you away from that mainland to those coast, where you can see that that shore, that never-ending shore.
yeah, yeah. It's a great point, and it's makes me think of the concept of known and unknown, knowns and unknowns.
Right,
So the idea that the more you learn about something, the more unknown unknowns become known unknowns. So you
right,
end up
right.
knowing that you know less the more you know.
Exactly, and that's what ecological approach does to you. All the questions we have already addressed, that those are well and good, but instead of repeating those paradigms and thinking of those like written in stone, the ecological approach kind of puts makes us realize our actual. It just again privileges the cognition and nervous system that don't take it like so lightly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely agree. Yeah, and that's what really good scientific theories do. They force you to question things that you otherwise wouldn't question.
Right. So thanks, Brandon. This was fascinating to have you again. And I hope we'll meet again and discuss another issue related to cognition in a similar detail.
Absolutely, always love hanging out with you, and hope you take care.
You too. Bye, Brandon.
Thanks, bye.